This unit is talking about how unions interact in both competitive labor markets and non-competitive labor markets, which we haven't gone over yet, but we will go over in this unit here. So when we are looking at unions, there's four types of unions. There's a closed shop, and this is where an employer can only hire union members. Obviously, that is very restrictive, and today the most of those are now illegal because of the Taft-Hartley Act. You have a union shop. Workers must join the union after being hired. Typically, about 30 days is when they have to join the union. And that's quite common, especially in many industrial states, northern states. Union shops still exist. Agency shops are where workers do not have to join the union, but they must pay dues. And then you have finally what they call an open shop. And this is where a union may represent all workers, but the workers do not have to join the union, nor do they have to pay the dues. States that have right to work laws will have open shops. And when it comes to dealing with unions, the Wagner Act, or what was officially called the National Labor Relations Act, gave unions the right to collective bargaining. And so that was the first time, it was during the Great Depression, that unions finally actually had the official right to collective bargaining. But in the aftermath of World War II, they passed the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947, and this outlawed the closed shops, and it also gave the president the power to seek a court injunction. And this is something that actually managers can now seek as well, to force workers back to work. Back in the early 1980s, in the Reagan administration, the air traffic controllers went on strike, and Reagan actually fired them all. Because he actually had a court order for them to go back to work. He considered them critical, and if those who failed to return were going to be fired. And so, what is collective bargaining? This is the process of negotiating the conditions of employment. Generally, your wages, your working hours, and the working conditions. The two sides in collective bargaining are labor and management. Labor represents workers, management represents the owners or their representatives. And when it comes to various tactics in trying to negotiate, labor has three tactics. They can picket, where they hold signs outside the business. They can boycott, where they refuse to buy the products or use the business, and they can strike. And that's the most effective weapon there, the strike, the refusal to work. Obviously, if you strike, you do not collect an income. So unions sometimes pay their workers a small wage while they are on strike. The management tactics are they can hire replacement workers, or what the union likes to call them as scabs. During, I believe it was 1987, the NFL strike, the NFL owners decided to hire replacement players, and they played 3 or 4 games with replacement players. So that is a possibility. They can seek a court injunction, which is a court order to force the union members back to work. And then lastly, there's a lockout, where they close the doors to the business. They refuse to open. Hockey, when they didn't reach a collective bargaining agreement, the NHL owners decided to not open the season until they had one. That prevents the athletes or the workers from gaining a salary. And so that's a tactic that can be used. So, how does a union operate in a perfectly competitive labor market? I have a graphing video. You want to click on the link here, and it'll go through all that. And then when we look at what are non-competitive labor markets, excuse me, I'm losing my voice. This is what we call a monopsony. And this is when one firm they hire such a significant portion of the labor force that they can set the wages. So they are a wage maker. And monopsony is essentially the opposite of a monopoly. So you'll see this in where you have mining firms in a remote area. They're the biggest employer. They have monopsony power. In the Lehigh Valley many years ago, it was Bethlehem Steel and Mack Trucks. They hired such a significant chunk of the valley. They were monopsonistic employers. Um, Hospitals and schools have monopsony power, because if you're a doctor, there's only so many hospitals you can work for. If you're a teacher, there's only so many schools that you could work for. You're very limited, and so they have some monopsony power. Obviously, In schools, they have unions. Nurses have begun forming unions. Doctors haven't. Uh, so when it comes to this, a monopsony power, they are a wage maker. Now, in the graphing video I'm going to show you, or that you can watch, the key characteristic is the supply curve is not the same as the marginal resource cost curve. And the reason for that is in order to attract more workers, they must raise wages. And when they do that, they are essentially raising their costs, their marginal resource cost. So their marginal resource costs will be greater than they would in any other market because they have to raise wages to attract workers. So, what happens when you have a union and a monopsony? This is what we call a bilateral monopoly. And the name for this situation is because you have a monopoly in two areas. You have a monopoly on the union side in hiring workers, um, or employing workers, and then you have a monopoly power by the employer because they are essentially wage makers. And so I have in the graphing video on monopsony, I go through what happens when you have a monopoly. And the key concept here is you cannot determine the wage rate in a bilateral monopoly. You're not going to be able to pinpoint that on a graph, and you won't have to worry about any of this on the AP exam. This is just for future background. Uh, so it all depends on who has the better bargaining position, labor or management. It's going to be closer to their position, and this will make sense when you watch the video. So this summarizes, what happens when you have a union in both competitive labor markets and non-competitive labor markets, which are what we call a monopsony.